John Gotti, Charles Lucky Luciano, and Joe Colombo, three names that defined the American Mafia's most ruthless and cunning era, were said to have shared the same room on a bitter December night in 1981. It was a meeting shrouded in secrecy, a convergence of ambition, power, and betrayal that would ignite one of the greatest mysteries in organized crime history. By dawn, a fire reduced the Brooklyn warehouse to ashes, leaving behind no witnesses, only whispers of what transpired inside. In the shadowy underworld of the 20th century American Mafia, three names towered above the rest: John Gotti, Charles Lucky Luciano, and Joe Colombo. Each represented a distinct chapter in the evolution of organized crime, and their legacies were etched in blood and secrecy. Gotti, the brash and flamboyant Teflon Don, embodied the audacity of the modern mafia, turning courtroom victories into public spectacles and charming his way into the hearts of New Yorkers while ruthlessly eliminating his enemies. Luciano, often credited as the architect of the American mafia, had redefined the game decades earlier by creating the Commission, a governing body designed to mediate disputes and streamline operations among the five families. Colombo, a man of contradictions, had made waves by blending calculated defiance with a veneer of respectability, famously organizing the Italian-American Civil Rights League while secretly consolidating his power. The idea that these three men could have converged on a single night in a single room was almost unthinkable. Their personalities, ambitions, and eras seemed too divergent to align. Yet, in the criminal underworld, alliances were often forged out of necessity rather than trust. The whispers of an unprecedented meeting began to spread in the days leading up to a bitterly cold December night. No one knew the exact location, but rumors pointed to a dilapidated warehouse in an industrial corner of Brooklyn. The venue was perfect for such a gathering: remote, desolate, and shielded from prying eyes. Each man arrived under the cover of darkness, their entourages carefully stationed at the periphery to avoid detection. The warehouse itself was an ominous sight, its rusted exterior and shattered windows a testament to years of neglect. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of damp wood and the faint metallic tang of old machinery. A single bulb hung from the ceiling, casting long, flickering shadows across the room. This was no grand conference hall, but it suited the gravity of the occasion. What had drawn these men together remained a subject of speculation for years. Some believed it was an attempt to reconcile the growing divisions within the mafia. The families were fracturing under the pressures of law enforcement, internal betrayals, and changing societal norms. Others theorized that the meeting was an ambitious move to create a unified front, extending the mafia's reach beyond its traditional confines into global enterprises such as arms dealing and financial fraud. Despite their common goals, the tensions between the three men were palpable. Luciano, though retired and residing in Italy at the time, was still regarded as the elder statesman of the mafia, his word carrying immense weight. He was a purist, staunchly opposed to the drug trade that had become increasingly lucrative but also perilously risky. Gotti, by contrast, was a product of his time, embracing the glitz and greed of the 1980s. To him, narcotics represented the future, a high-reward venture worth the gamble. Colombo, ever the mediator, positioned himself as the voice of reason, though his true motives were shrouded in secrecy. The meeting was shrouded in silence, broken only by the occasional creak of the wooden floorboards and the muffled hum of distant machinery. Outside, the icy wind howled through the empty streets, creating a haunting backdrop to the clandestine gathering. Time seemed to stand still as the three men negotiated, debated, and calculated their next moves. Whatever decisions were made that night, they would echo through the corridors of power, shaping the destiny of organized crime for generations to come. The idea of this meeting was audacious, almost mythic, and for many, it bordered on the impossible. Yet, if it truly happened, it marked a turning point, a fleeting moment where the titans of the mafia came together, not as adversaries, but as co-conspirators in a game that neither law enforcement nor history could fully unravel. FBI agent Thomas Monroe had spent nearly 2 decades entrenched in the relentless pursuit of organized crime. His office walls were lined with files, maps, and photographs, a chaotic mosaic chronicling the rise and fall of mob bosses, the bloody rivalries between families, and the occasional, often mysterious alliances that defied logic. Monroe was known for his methodical approach, sifting through mountains of seemingly inconsequential details to uncover patterns others overlooked. It was this tenacity that led him to the discovery of a file that would change the trajectory of his career. In the summer of 1992, a raid on a Colombo family safe house yielded an array of documents, cash, and coded ledgers. Most of it was routine, evidence of extortion rackets, loan sharking operations, and money laundering schemes. But buried among the papers was a faded envelope marked with three names: Luciano, Colombo, and Gotti. At first glance, it appeared unremarkable, but the names alone were enough to capture Monroe's attention. Scribbled on the back of the envelope was a date, December 15th, 1981. The contents of the envelope were cryptic, consisting of a single typewritten page filled with phrases that seemed disjointed, yet ominous. References to a triad council, mentions of territorial redistribution, and a veiled allusion to consolidating influence hinted at something larger than routine criminal operations. Monroe's instincts told him he had stumbled upon evidence of a meeting that could rewrite the understanding of mafia dynamics. For months, Monroe immersed himself in the investigation, poring over old surveillance reports, informant testimonies, and intercepted communications. Patterns began to emerge. The date on the envelope coincided with a sudden, uncharacteristic truce among the traditionally feuding families. Around the same time, there was an inexplicable surge in counterfeit operations, and several high-ranking mafia figures known for their dissenting views vanished without a trace. What perplexed Monroe the most was the apparent collaboration between men who, by all accounts, should have been adversaries. Luciano, though exiled to Italy following his release from prison, had remained a revered figure whose approval carried immense weight within the mafia. Colombo's name, however, was controversial. He had survived an assassination attempt in 1971 and had since been a polarizing figure within his own family. Gotti, the youngest of the trio, was still consolidating his power and navigating the treacherous waters of leadership after orchestrating the murder of Paul Castellano. Monroe's findings pointed to a chilling possibility that these men had come together to establish a new order. The mafia, long defined by its rigid family structure and territorial disputes, seemed to be evolving into something more cohesive and far-reaching. If true, this would explain the sudden alignment of criminal enterprises across multiple states and the precision with which certain operations were executed. As Monroe dug deeper, the investigation took a darker turn. Several informants who had provided valuable insights began retracting their statements, citing fear for their lives. Key witnesses disappeared, their homes abandoned, as if they had vanished overnight. Even Monroe's own superiors seemed reluctant to pursue the case, urging him to focus on more concrete threats. Despite the mounting obstacles, Monroe pressed on, convinced he was on the verge of uncovering one of the most significant events in mafia history. Yet, the closer he got to the truth, the more he realized the risks. The mafia had survived for so long, not just because of its brutality, but because of its mastery of deception and its ability to silence those who knew too much. Monroe began to sense that he was being watched, his every move scrutinized by unseen eyes. The file, now locked away in Monroe's desk drawer, became both his obsession and his burden. It was a puzzle with missing pieces, a story that defied logic but carried an undeniable weight. Monroe couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just another mafia power play. It was a defining moment, one that had shaped the criminal underworld in ways few could comprehend. And yet, the deeper he ventured, the more elusive the truth became, like a shadow that dissolved the moment it was grasped. The world of organized crime thrived on loyalty, but loyalty was often a facade. Betrayal lingered in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. Within the secretive meeting that brought Gotti, Luciano, and Colombo together, the cracks in their fragile alliance began to show. Behind the closed doors of the Brooklyn warehouse, the stakes were immeasurably high, and the presence of a fourth man, Vincent Vinnie Calderone, added a layer of complexity that no one foresaw. Calderone was no ordinary lieutenant. He had been a trusted ally of Lucky Luciano during the early days of the commission. Quiet, calculating, and dangerously observant, he had built a reputation as a problem solver. He was also, unbeknownst to most, a man with his own agenda. As the Mafia's internal conflicts escalated, Calderone found himself courted by federal agents who offered him immunity in exchange for information. The government, desperate to dismantle the Mafia's ever-expanding influence, saw Calderone as a potential key to unlocking its secrets. Calderone's assignment that night was clear: attend the meeting under the guise of Luciano's representative and gather intelligence on the alliance's plans. The agents wanted names, strategies, and weaknesses, anything that could help them dismantle the Mafia's grip on the nation. Calderone knew he was playing a dangerous game. If his duplicity were discovered, there would be no escape. The meeting was tense from the start. Luciano, ever the traditionalist, was firm in his belief that the Mafia's strength lay in its discipline and secrecy. Gotti, a brash and ambitious figure, represented the new generation, a leader unafraid to court public attention and willing to embrace high-risk ventures like narcotics. Colombo, ever the pragmatist, sought to mediate, presenting himself as a voice of unity. Yet, behind his diplomatic demeanor, he was carefully gauging the power dynamics in the room, looking for any opportunity to strengthen his position. As the hours wore on, disagreements began to surface. Gotti's push for an aggressive expansion into drug trafficking sparked a fierce debate. Luciano, having witnessed the devastating consequences of the heroin trade in the 1950s, vehemently opposed the idea, warning that it would bring relentless federal scrutiny. Gotti countered that the profits were too lucrative to ignore, painting a picture of untapped wealth that could secure the Mafia's dominance for decades. Calderone watched from the sidelines, silently absorbing every word. He knew his federal handlers would see Gotti's boldness as a weakness to exploit and Luciano's resistance as a potential fracture point. What he didn't anticipate was the rising tension between Colombo and Gotti. Colombo's attempts to placate Gotti were met with thinly veiled hostility, and it became clear that their alliance was anything but stable. At some point during the meeting, Calderone's duplicity came dangerously close to being exposed. Colombo, ever perceptive, questioned his motives, pointing out inconsistencies in his statements. Calderone deflected skillfully, but the seed of doubt had been planted. As tempers flared, the room seemed ready to explode. The pivotal moment came when a loud crash outside the warehouse interrupted the proceedings. The sound, possibly a stray cat or shifting debris, was enough to ignite paranoia. Gotti, always on edge, accused Luciano of setting a trap. Colombo, trying to calm the situation, only fueled Gotti's suspicions. Calderone, caught in the middle, struggled to maintain his composure, knowing that his life hung by a thread. In the chaos, the fragile alliance began to crumble. Words turned to threats, and Calderone's carefully constructed facade started to unravel. The meeting ended abruptly, leaving questions unanswered and alliances shattered. Calderone slipped away into the night, knowing he had narrowly escaped exposure. But the cost of his betrayal was yet to be determined, and the fallout from that night would haunt him and the Mafia forever. The flames tore through the abandoned warehouse like a living entity, consuming everything in their path. By the time the fire department arrived, it was too late. The structure had collapsed in on itself, leaving only charred beams and smoldering debris. Witnesses from the nearby industrial district recalled hearing a series of sharp explosions before seeing the blaze light up the night sky. For law enforcement, the fire was another grim reminder of the Mafia's ability to erase its own secrets. When the smoke cleared, investigators found 3 bodies among the wreckage. They were burned beyond recognition, and no identifying evidence survived. Forensic analysis was limited, and without definitive proof, speculation filled the void. Whispers spread that the 3 men inside were Gotti, Luciano, and Colombo, the very men rumored to have met there that night. If true, the implications were staggering. The official explanation was vague. Authorities initially attributed the fire to an accidental gas leak, a plausible conclusion for an old warehouse in disrepair. However, seasoned detectives and FBI agents weren't convinced. The timing of the fire, coinciding with the rumored meeting, was too convenient to dismiss. Agent Thomas Monroe, who had been following the trail of evidence connecting Gotti, Luciano, and Colombo, was particularly skeptical. To him, the fire bore the hallmarks of a deliberate act, a final play in a high-stakes game of power and betrayal. Monroe's investigation into the blaze unearthed troubling details. Firefighters reported that accelerants were likely used, suggesting arson. Witnesses described seeing shadowy figures fleeing the scene moments before the first explosion. Among the debris, fragments of a metal suitcase were recovered, charred but intact enough to suggest it had been part of a larger container. Theories abounded. Was the suitcase carrying money, incriminating documents, or something far more sinister? As Monroe delved deeper, he encountered resistance at every turn. Evidence went missing, witnesses refused to speak, and even his colleagues seemed reluctant to pursue the case. The Mafia's reach extended far beyond the criminal underworld. Its influence seeped into institutions meant to uphold justice. The deeper Monroe dug, the more isolated he became, until it felt as if he were chasing ghosts in a city that refused to see them. The possibility that Gotti, Luciano, and Colombo had perished in the fire posed a paradox. If the three most powerful figures in organized crime were dead, why did their empires continue to operate without interruption? Across the country, mafia operations proceeded as though nothing had happened. It was as if the fire had claimed no lives at all, or perhaps claimed the wrong ones. Adding to the mystery was the absence of Vincent Vinnie Calderone, the lieutenant whose presence at the meeting had been confirmed through Monroe's earlier findings. Calderone disappeared without a trace after that night. His name was quietly removed from Mafia records, and his trail went cold. Some believed he had been killed in the fire, silenced for his betrayal. Others speculated he had fled, using his connections with federal agents to secure a new identity. Monroe couldn't shake the feeling that the fire was a carefully orchestrated cover-up, designed not only to eliminate key players, but to obscure the truth. If Calderone had survived, he might have been the only one who knew what really happened inside the warehouse. The fire had obliterated more than evidence. It had consumed the story itself, leaving behind only fragments for Monroe to piece together. The fallout from the warehouse inferno rippled through the criminal underworld. Rumors of betrayal and power struggles spread like wildfire, but none could be substantiated. The Mafia, true to its nature, closed ranks, ensuring that no answers would emerge. For Monroe, the case became an obsession, a puzzle with missing pieces that taunted him for the rest of his career. The fire at the Brooklyn warehouse was more than a tragedy. It was a statement. It sent a clear message to anyone who dared to question the Mafia's authority. Their secrets were theirs to keep, even if it meant erasing them in the most brutal way possible. The years that followed the warehouse fire were marked by a heavy silence. The Mafia's operations continued, seemingly untouched, while whispers of what transpired that night faded into urban legend. Law enforcement, led by Agent Thomas Monroe, pressed on, but the trail grew colder with each passing month. Witnesses disappeared, informants fell silent, and the once vivid rumors surrounding the meeting dulled into fragments of speculation. Yet, behind closed doors, the events of that night left an indelible mark on the balance of power within the criminal underworld. The fire was a catalyst, igniting a new era for the Mafia. In the wake of the supposed deaths of Gotti, Luciano, and Colombo, the families appeared more united than ever. Their operations became more sophisticated, their criminal enterprises more expansive. Interstate smuggling routes flourished, offshore accounts swelled, and technology became a new tool in their arsenal. It was as if the destruction of the warehouse had given rise to a stronger, more resilient network, a hydra that replaced each severed head with two more. For Monroe, the case turned into an obsession. He pored over old files, interviewed retired agents, and tracked every lead, no matter how tenuous. His superiors grew impatient, urging him to focus on cases with more actionable evidence, but Monroe refused to let go. The missing pieces haunted him: the unexplained presence of accelerants, the fragments of the metal suitcase, the sudden disappearance of Calderone. Each clue felt like a breadcrumb leading to a greater truth, one that remained just out of reach. The breakthrough came years later, in the most unlikely of circumstances. A dock worker in Sicily discovered an unmarked crate washed ashore after a storm. Inside was a collection of old documents, water-damaged but still legible. Among them was a ledger, its pages filled with coded entries. Experts identified connections to both American and Italian mafia operations, but one page stood out. It contained a crude sketch of a warehouse floor plan and a list of names, three of them unmistakable: Gotti, Luciano, and Colombo. The ledger reignited Monroe's investigation, though he now worked alone, having retired from the FBI to pursue the case on his own terms. He traveled to Sicily, retracing the ledger's origins, and uncovered a chilling theory. The fire wasn't merely a meeting gone wrong, it was a purge. It seemed increasingly likely that Calderone had orchestrated the events, using his dual loyalties to eliminate the Mafia's old guard and secure his own position. Yet, Calderone was nowhere to be found. Sightings surfaced sporadically from Buenos Aires to Hong Kong, but none could be confirmed. Some speculated he had brokered a deal with the government, living under a new identity in witness protection. Others believed he had been betrayed by the very agents who sought his help, silenced to ensure the secrets he carried would never resurface. The truth of that night in Brooklyn remained elusive. Monroe published a book detailing his findings, a meticulous account of his investigation interwoven with theories and unanswered questions. It became a bestseller, captivating the public with its blend of fact and mystery. Yet, even as readers debated the truth, Monroe felt no closure. He knew the Mafia's greatest weapon was its ability to rewrite its own history, burying the past beneath layers of lies and fear. The warehouse fire faded into the annals of true crime lore, its legacy a cautionary tale of power, betrayal, and the lengths to which men would go to protect their secrets. For Monroe, it was a reminder of the limits of justice in the face of an enemy that thrived in the shadows. The Mafia endured, evolving into something both familiar and unrecognizable, its foundations built on the ashes of that fateful night.